This talk's part of the Graduate Studies lecture series sponsored by the graduate program in curatorial practice. And as I think you know, this year the series goes under the heading of Signal Years. So each talk kind of is anchored by a reflection on a cultural event in a particular year. This evening is 1997. There are a number of ways I think that those of us interested in the kind of history of exhibition making, history of curating, see 1997 as especially kind of pivotal or interesting. As also the year of Documented 10, which had an important legacy in other ways and other events too. But for us here, the focus is really on the second Johannesburg Biennial. And so we have, which was the second and last Johannesburg Biennial, and so one of the, and it's had a certain kind of sort of resonance both in the context of contemporary art in South Africa at the time and since, and also in the context of what an international biennial could be. So we have to speak about that, primarily, really, I think the first person account of that event. Olu Oguibe is professor at the Institute of American Studies and Departments of Art and Art History, University of Connecticut, and was a member of the curatorial team of the second Johannesburg Biennial in 1997, and actually an artist in the exhibition, and a convener of the symposium for that event. In fact, one of the distinctive aspects of that biennial was the kind of juxtaposition of a kind of discursive programming with a series of exhibitions. We also have, let me just introduce everyone who's here. So we have Vaughn Sadie and Kemang Lehulere, who have work doing projects in the exhibition that's at YBCA, and we're probably in middle school or something when the 97 biennial happened, almost, and not quite. Okay, well, generous. But the question is, that's kind of partly why we invited them to join Olu tonight, because 1997, it's if you're a kind of a younger artist, it's a little bit outside the kind of operative memory of your work. So there's a certain sense it's a legacy that you're inheriting, which is not really part of your own kind of, at least adult cultural life. So part of our question here later on when we get to it for Vaughn and Kemang is what the history of that biennial may or may not continue to mean, and whatever proved to be the kind of the key ideas that still live, discussions that come out of what we cover with Olu. What's the status of those ideas now? Primarily, first of all, I think that biennial made a certain claim around the idea of a transnational art exhibition, and a lot of what it tried to do, and a lot of the sort of tension and controversy even around that was around what it is to do a kind of a transnational art event. At that moment in South African history, this is merely 3 years after the first fully democratic elections, and in a sense it was a transnational event that was inserting itself in a nation that was not yet even fully formed. So I think one thing we're going to talk about is kind of the nationalism and transnationalism at that moment, and then perhaps the legacy of that. I have a couple of quotes before I ask Olu to speak a little bit about what the biennial meant at that time and how it seems from now. First of all, it was the overall artistic director, Okwui Enwezor, set out something of what he hoped that event would achieve in the catalogue. Just a few lines from that. The biennial was designed to examine the history of globalization by exploring how economic imperatives of the last 500 years have produced resilient cultural fusions and disjunctions. Its purpose was to give critical significance to those modes of contestation, analysis, exploration, and interpretation with which contemporary artists contend and to contemplate shifts that have led to the redefinition of our senses of society. Okay, just do a bit more. Consequently, the exhibitions would explore how culture and space have been historically displaced through colonialization, migration, and technology, and engage by emphasizing how innovative practices have led to redefinitions and inventions of our notions of expression, with shifts in the language and discourses of art. Titled, you may know, Trade Routes, History and Geography, and throughout, kind of a powerful claim about the transnational and the possibility of South Africa participating in such a thing. The other quote I have is from a collaborator of Kemang's. This is from Gabby and Kobo, with whom Kemang collaborates in a collective called the Center of Historical Reenactment. This is actually a text from the Ungovernables, the new museum a couple of years ago. And in a way, this is to kind of measure the distance possibly between then and now. She writes, "A younger generation of artists, too young to have known their uncle, the Johannesburg Biennial, whose recollections of his stature are faint and often told how their uncle loved them and had only good intentions for their future. They are told that they wouldn't occupy the space they do in the international art scene if their beloved uncle hadn't paved the way. A dark cloud is all that remains of what was once the hope, not only of the country's art scene, but of the whole continent, if not the global art world. It is because the world came here that we are now in the world." So I'm going to, the value and merits of this event have been debated and written about, but not for a while. And some people here will be familiar with those debates, and some people are utterly unfamiliar with this event at all. And so it's wonderful to have Olu here to dig deep and remember what it meant to do this event at that time and some of the forces and energies around it.
Thank you. I wanted, can you hear me at the back? Because I'm not sure if my microphone is working. Is that any better? Am I live? You see the light? Okay. My preferred style actually is conversational. I didn't want to go up the podium and give a lecture because this is more an exercise in oral history. As Dominic said, a great deal has been written about the Johannesburg Biennial. It's probably one of the most written about biennials in recent times because of its groundbreaking nature. First of all, because it was in Africa, that in itself was somewhat groundbreaking. Not because there weren't biennials in Africa before that, but those were fairly regional in nature. And the Johannesburg Biennial, especially the second Johannesburg Biennial, was on a different scale with a different frame altogether. So that in itself was groundbreaking, and therefore attracted a whole lot of debate and discussion in the art press as well as scholarship subsequently. Much of what I am supposed to do has actually been very competently done, I think, in a text that Sabine Marshall wrote in 1999. And that text is called The Impact of the Two Johannesburg Biennials on the Formation of a New South African Art. That's precisely what I'm supposed to talk about, so I might as well just read you guys the text, because I think she does a good job, but albeit that at the end of the text she does rib me somewhat. You know, I get the heavy end of the stick at the end of the text, but that's okay. I still think that she did a good job of trying to summarize what it was all about, at least from a scholar's point of view, from an outsider's point of view. I'll talk a little bit about my own involvement in the Johannesburg Biennial. It did fit into a time of very active and activist excitement globally, especially in the West. In fact, perhaps more so in the West than in the rest of the world. But of course, politically, we know it's the period of the end of apartheid. That's a given. But outside of that, on the global stage, in several places in Britain and the United States and so on, there were several other activities and exhibitions and conferences and so on and so forth that centered around decentering the art world, moving beyond New York and Berlin and London, and trying to acknowledge other centers in the developing world. Some of you might, if you've been in town long enough or you're old enough, you might know Hu Hanru. I was discussing with someone else earlier on. That's actually how I met him. You know, we were young people in the early 90s and part of all the different conferences discussing these other centers. And those were very exciting times, I have to confess. And we were reading people like Stuart Hall, who's just died in Britain, trying to define a multicultural platform and stage to move outside of the usual, up to that point, Eurocentric. So many centrics at the time, not just the Eurocentric, but also the Afrocentric, and move toward a more universalist, multicultural discourse. So that's one context. And round about that same time, you had Africa 95 in London. Africa 95 was a huge exhibition at the Whitechapel. That was pretty much like it was in structures very much like a biennial, because it had representations from all the different African nations, you know, and curators were drawn from those countries to pick artists from those countries, just like you would do at the Venice Biennial or something, except there weren't pavilions for the different countries. So there's a great deal that Africa 95 drew from that, and it was supposed to be a celebration of a new and emergent Africa, if you like, what in South Africa they would eventually term the African Renaissance, whatever that is. But that was in the air, you know, and Africa 95 tried to celebrate that in London. So around about the same time that you had Africa 95 happening in London, you had the first biennial in Johannesburg, which was Africus in 1995. On the other side of the ocean, I had just moved to New York in 1995 because Okwui Enwezor, who was at SFMOMA, and I were beginning a new magazine, a new art magazine devoted to contemporary African art. I don't know if it was the first of its nature, but it certainly was different from anything that had been available before. And there's a story to that too. It's a small story. So it's because it's an oral history thing, I'm going to go in all sorts of directions, and hopefully we'll pull the strings together. But slightly earlier, at the end of the 80s, when these discussions began, in London, for instance, with the other story, which was a big exhibition at the, where was the other? It was a Hayward. Yeah. One of the challenges that people had was how to give voice to a greater multiplicity of participants in the global contemporary art discourse. We all felt like there were the established institutions, and these included art magazines that you couldn't get into. You know, if you wanted to write for Art in America and stuff, you know, you had to know someone in Art in America. They had to commission you, or you had to, you know, write an article and hope that it makes it after 2 years or whatever. And at the time, personally, not being particularly interested in high-profile platforms, I was quite ready to express myself and some of these views wherever I had the opportunity, whether it was a local newspaper in London, or it was an obscure art magazine coming out of somewhere in Detroit. It didn't matter to me, as long as there was some room for me to say something about what, as a generation, we were beginning to feel. I would take that opportunity. And in the process of that, some of those obscure texts were circulating in places that I wasn't aware of. And I understand that out in New York, a young Nigerian named Okwui Enwezor read one of those texts and had a light bulb in the mind moment, and thought to himself, if only we had our own magazines and our own institutions and our own platforms, then we wouldn't have to wait on others to give us the opportunity to allow us in. So I think that was part of the emerging mindset at the time, is that now we have to create our own platforms. We have to create our own opportunities. We have to install our own doors rather than wait for doors to be opened for us. You know, we'll build our own houses and put in our own doors, and then we can let others in when we feel like it. So he thought, why don't we start a magazine? And he sent me, in those days, faxes came in, they came on a roll. And I was working with a non-profit organization at the time that helped immigrants in London, volunteering after my PhD. It seemed more fruitful to do that than to try and get an instant job in the academy. And I got, it might have been 15 feet of handwritten, you know, a really scrawly handwritten text. It just came, you know, kept coming in, and I was like, what is this? Because I never heard of him before. And he went on and on and on about how important it was for us to get together and think about beginning to build institutions as I'm sorry, I feel quite emotional about that. And we went back to Fanon because Fanon was very important in our upbringing as young people in Nigeria, interestingly enough. It was required reading. Paulo Freire, Frantz Fanon, that's what you carried in your back pocket. You know, you read that and you can memorize the quotations. And Fanon had said something about each generation discovering its mission and either fulfilling it or betraying it. And building institutions was one of the things that we felt was part of our mission as a generation. So we founded this magazine, and Nka would not only set the tone, I think, for how people would read contemporary African cultural production afterwards, but it would also build careers. And it's very fulfilling to have been part of that. I look back now, you know, I'm a practicing artist, and I'm not a superstar. Most of my colleagues are superstars. In fact, I learned about one of them yesterday that we exhibited in Arbissola, Italy, in 2002. And someone was going on about some Korean artist whose work is fantastic, and she sells work for for $2 million, and they were trying to get a work of hers for the San Francisco airport, and they couldn't do that. And I was like, who is that? Because I know Korea a little bit. I've been out there a couple of times. Who is this artist? Eventually, it turned out this is an artist that I'd exhibited with, and her husband had, in fact, invited me out to Korea. And now she's commanding $2 million. I'm like, wow, that's interesting. I need to go back, I need to get another invitation. But the point I'm making is that even if in my own career as an artist, I've not joined the superstars, I feel very fulfilled to have been at certain junctures and certain moments in the cultural history of the past 20, 30 years, and to have, in my own little way, in our all different little ways, contributed to building institutions, setting up platforms, breaking down doors, putting our foot in doors and getting hurt in the process. But you have to put a hand or a foot in there, and stay there until someone opens that door for you. And
I was going to say, you were saying to me earlier today how what you and Okwui and others were trying to do in CAR and other publications became, if you like, the kind of intellectual matrix for what the biennial,
it would become,
how the biennial took shape?
Yeah, it would become, because it was within a framework. It wasn't just the publications themselves. All of that work fit into that framework of not only providing opportunities, but also creating platforms for expression and redefining the way that the world read African cultural production, especially contemporary African cultural production. So the biennial will become just an extension of what we started with the magazines and with the texts in obscure newspapers and so on and so forth. So when it came time, I moved to the United States, we founded the magazine, and it actually quite, in a very causalist way, the magazine led to Okui's appointment as artistic director of the Johannesburg Biennale, because the magazine exposed us to a certain gentleman, Spanish curator named Octavio Zaya, and his brother Antonio, and they'd been involved in the first biennial in 1995. And it was in the process of working with Octavio that he sent Okwui Enwezor to South Africa to research Drum magazine. And it was during that research trip that he made the connections that would lead to the invitation to be involved with the Johannesburg Biennale. Just to give you a quick sense of how intense some of these efforts were, and how foolishly overambitious we were as a generation. I was mentioning to Dominic that the Johannesburg Biennale would be the very second exhibition that Okwui Enwezor would be involved in as a curator. And he went from not being part of the art world to directing Documenta in 5 years. That's how determined we were to break down the doors, even if it's with a sledgehammer, but of course do it with style. And a lot of
always
a lot of intellectual sophistication, I think. So these are all efforts to. I think the relevance of this is because it's that, in a sense, our understanding of our mission with the Johannesburg Biennale, when it came time for Okwui to direct it, was somewhat different from the expectations within South Africa. The expectations and perhaps the mission of those who were in the say in South Africa, as far as the biennial was concerned, was not on such a globalist scale as we were thinking, coming from London, coming from New York, dealing with curators from Spain and Japan and so on and so forth. Our mission was to create a place on the global stage. Their understanding was to expand within Africa, integrate South Africa more fully into the continent before thinking of the rest of the world. Many of them weren't there yet. So obviously, there was bound to be some conflict when it came to Okwui's idea.
How early on in the process was that divergence of aims apparent?
Well, we weren't aware of what people were thinking within South Africa. You see, we were conceiving this thing in New York.
Okay.
Quite frankly. And so as far as the two of us were concerned, in fact, our entry into the South African art world were a couple of individuals, Colin Richards, who died unfortunately recently, Kendall Gears, young artist and curator and provocateur at the time, and a few other people. We weren't on the ground, and mind you, South Africa had just come out of isolationist apartheid, so we weren't like visiting South Africa, checking out what's going on. And so it didn't. I think Okwui, in fact, arrived in South Africa to be resident to direct the biennial before discovering some of the schisms, which led to a lot of frustration. So that, in a sense, without being very articulate, in a sense that was the context. So there were all these conversations going on outside of South Africa in terms of being part of a global conversation around contemporary art and recognizing that Africans can be part of that and that they have things to say and things to contribute, things to bring to the table. While within the continent and the country itself, there was a slightly different conversation going on.
So say a bit about the structure of it, the form that was chosen. There were 160 artists, 63 different countries, and you were explaining earlier about kind of different platforms in a sense, and venues and locations in the country, even not only in Johannesburg.
Yeah. Some of the structure actually drew from the first biennial because they also had several contributing curators. But we were also intent on at least following our own understanding of the political structure within the country itself and even the geographic dispersal of conversations within South Africa. We were aware that Cape Town was fairly different at that time from Johannesburg. Cape Town was fairly radical in a liberal kind of way, more English, and somewhat more receptive to progressive ideas. Johannesburg was more gritty. It was the site of the mines and so on and so forth. So even in terms of class, there were differences between those two cities. So as we were conceiving this, we thought of involving as much of the country in the biennial as possible. But for those of you who are not familiar with the biennial itself, like you mentioned, the theme was trade routes. And in one of those trips that European adventurers had made, explorers had made on their way to find the East for the spice trade, they'd been shipwrecked on the Cape, which is part of the story of South Africa. I talked about that with Dominic in the afternoon. It was very interesting that because of apartheid, people's understanding, even within South Africa, of the history of the country was far more divisionist than the real history of the country, because as far back as the 1730s, there was already a biracial person who is a South African, because when the British were shipwrecked on the Cape, one of the young women who was part of the party ran off with the natives and got married with them and had children. So 300 years, almost 400 years ago, there were already South Africans who were neither black nor white, and instead both. So the history of South Africa and the history of that part of the continent, the arrival of the Europeans, the occupation of the country, all the traumatic confrontations that took place, not just between white and black, but also between the Boers and the British, all arrived there or came as a result of this trade routes that ran through the Cape, coming from Europe, trying to get to Asia. And so, and actually before that too, some part of the silk route, the silk trade that went to China, actually went through Zimbabwe. And some products went from there, and there was all kinds of exchanges that took place long before the arrival of the Europeans on the continent. So we thought that in order to create a more inclusive narrative of not just the politics but also the cultural history of the country and the continent, we had to explore this idea of the meeting of people through exchange, the trade routes that ran through South Africa. Long and short of it is that these were very ambitious ideas for a biennial that was only in its second phase, that was meant by politicians to be an opportunity to invite other Africans and so on and have a celebration. And so we kind of went overboard with our intentions.
I mean, one of the sort of criticisms of the time, as I understand it, was in fact that it wasn't sufficiently responsive to an immediate context in South Africa. So, I mean, it's interesting you're saying here that you were almost, at least at one level, perhaps had in mind this kind of archaeology of a deeper, more hybrid South Africa,
yeah,
but the immediate apprehension was that this was a biennial for an international art community, right?
Yeah, I think in terms of the conceptualization, there's definitely that element. I don't think the criticism is actually is valid when you get to it, because when you begin to talk of impact or in terms of responsiveness to the immediate circumstances, I think we got around to that when we put on the show itself. But in terms of the overarching conceptual framework, you could certainly make a valid argument that there were some disconnections with the facts on the ground. We did make up for that because it had the greatest, far more than the first biennial, it had a greater number of South African artists involved.
Okay.
We have far more artists, South African artists involved in the second biennial than the first, in addition to all the other people that were coming from abroad. And I think that could then move us to what exactly happened there. Some of the information is available, readily available. I don't need to repeat it. But Okwui had co-curators. Mind you, he was still in the learning process. And Octavio and the others had co-curators for the first biennial, so he took that model and had co-curators as well. Quite a number of those I selected myself. Hu Hanru, whom I knew from Europe, knew him in London. Gerardo Mosquera from Cuba. Colin Richards I had already worked with. And in a sense, to tie this back to publications and to previous conversations, these people I knew because I was working or doing a lot of work, not working officially or formally, but doing a lot of work with Third Text, which is a journal that a gentleman named Rashida Rain founded in London. And Third Text was about third world contemporary cultures. So when it came to who should we get now as co-curators? Oh, I know who. Hanru, Gerardo, we did. There's a lot of incestuousness in these things. If there's a word like that, probably just incest. No, I like incestuousness. But you work with who you know. you work with who has the competence that's available to you as far as your knowledge goes. So there were several curators that were then assigned to different sites. In addition to that, we split the biennial into two, with one section happening in Johannesburg, and the South African component, as well as the Caribbean component happening, the African diaspora component happening in Cape Town. What's the distance between Johannesburg and Cape Town again? It's several
1,600 kilometers, or 1,200, 300, yes.
Miles or something like that. More than 1,000 miles.
It's like
right?
2 hours in a plane.
Yeah.
Yeah. So imagine a biennial that's happening across the country, on both sides of the country at the same time. Even the conference was split between those two cities. So we had part of the conference in Johannesburg, and then we all shipped off to Cape Town to have the rest of the conference. So no, I think we became aware of how important it was to attend to some of the sensitivities and sensibilities within the country itself, and we went further than the first biennial to attend to those concerns.
So I mean, there's some sort of issues here already in everything you say that we could.
I would round up by
we could bring out
talking very briefly about impact as far as we saw it. As far as we saw it, in terms of impact, I think our goal was to not only expose the world to talent within South Africa, but to also expose that talent to the world. There was a generational gap existing. There's an older generation of artists, many of whom were in exile, so they were already exposed to the rest of the world. And then there was a younger generation of artists who were coming up, who had not had opportunities at that time to be exposed to what was happening in contemporary art and culture outside of the continent. So this is basically bringing the mountain to Muhammad, and the world was very responsive. And when I say the world, I mean the art world. Most times we're cynical about the art world, but there's actually quite a few positive things that happen within that world. I know, it's not a particularly progressive world, but sometimes good things do happen. And one of the things that happened, I don't think we weren't directly responsible for it. One of the things that happened was that people at the Whitney Museum in New York and some of their funders, I think it might have been Peter Norton. Peter Norton is the gentleman who wrote. You guys are too young to actually remember Norton Utilities. Does anyone here remember Norton Utilities? Okay, it was what yeah, exactly. Okay, he wrote one of those things and made lots of money and retired early and became a patron of the arts. So he shipped every major curator in the United States to South Africa to go and see what South African artists are doing. Go see for yourself. You don't have to wait and write a grant to make a trip to South Africa to do studio visits. Although it's only for a week or so, all these people were shipped in to look around, and then you can go back on your own.
Like how many?
Oh, I think there was 100 of them. Yes, from all across the United States. And people had open studios. Young artists were exposed to older artists. They were exposed to international artists. They worked with them as assistants. They installed their works, because we all installed our work, you see. There wasn't a staff to put your work up. Every artist had to paint the room where they exhibited, sweep the floor. As convener of the conference, I was busy trying to welcome my guests for the conference, as well as trying to clean the room where I was setting up my work.
But this is there was a certain, if you like, symbiotic exchange that happened in the process that gave younger artists a boost of confidence when they saw what huge international artists were doing. They could compare that to their own work and feel like we're not doing too badly. And out of that, a whole generation of artists, Bernie Sill, and so on and so forth, would come out of the country and go on to win awards around the world and build careers without having to leave South Africa. My generation had to leave the continent to go to the centers of global contemporary practice. Now there was a generation, because we were able at least once to create this opportunity, that could go on practicing within their communities, but also have an interface with the rest of the world. Exhibit outside, travel outside, do artist residencies, and still come home and pay taxes in South Africa if they don't discover how to do it. Because you guys do a lot of offshore tax
him
stuff.
particularly? Okay, listen. So we've got some of the issues that are there in the whole story you're telling there are, there are some things that are specific to South Africa, and there are some things which are general. I mean, it's to do with what it is for so to speak, kind of peripheral locations. In relation to major economic centers of contemporary culture, what it is for those so-called peripheral locations to participate in a larger story, and into what their own trade routes can be. Right?
But it's important to reinsert it into what I mentioned earlier on, which is the discourse of other centers.
Right.
We didn't see those places as peripheral.
Right. Right.
That was the whole point. It's that these are active centers. You just happen not to have access to them, and we'll make that available at least and so there's a thing there about what's the function of the biennial form in doing that, and we have a whole category of biennials and other such events that actually if you like provide a sort of temporary cultural infrastructure in places that don't have so much of that. But when we think about the legacy here and some of the things, the issues that we could talk about and sort of gauge where they're at in the present. There's one thing is the sort of the possibility for South African artists to participate in this larger international conversation. The other thing probably is around institutions. So it sounds like from what you say, Okwui and you all had a vision for in the long term the development of African art institutions. Biennial itself was actually shut down briefly very soon after it opened. The authorities seemed to not want this, right, in terms of the cost or the message or whatever. No, there was also a sense of mission accomplished.
What, just to open?
Well, I mean, just after the opening.
Oh, yeah. So I know there was already a sense of kind of dissatisfaction from the authorities with this event, and of course, as we know, there were no further Johannesburg biennials. So I think maybe on those two counts, one thing about the further evolution of cultural infrastructure in South Africa, and then the other point about ways in which South African artists participate in a kind of transnational discourse. Whatever you tell me. Tell me, because I'm not going to say. You say. You have to say it to them.
Oh, yes, of course. Okay. Thanks, Olu. Is this thing on? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I wasn't even born when the Johannesburg
Is that for real?
No. I can speak from the point of view of a young artist based in South Africa, growing up in a time where South Africa was supposed to be progressive. We had the most, or so-called most advanced constitution in the world. Everything was supposed to be this amazing place, this rainbow nation, which the rest of the world was looking at. As an example, Nelson Mandela's rainbow nation. But in reality, this image or idea is not what I was experiencing or what I had grown up with. And it's funny, not funny, but curious listening to Olu speaking about having Fanon in his back pocket and Paulo Freire as well, because at a point in time, I co-founded an art collective called Collective, which was based in Cape Town. And we basically did the same. We had Fanon in our pockets. We had Paulo Freire. We were reading bell hooks. We were reading Olu, in fact, as well. Okwui, and these were the people who kind of influenced us. This kind of radical imagination. And in very similar way, we decided to build our own home and our own doors with this collective. So there was a sense of, okay, there's this thing that's happened. There was no art education in schools, still very lacking very much, which, as I've thought about, like, obviously in relation to the Johannesburg Biennale and what could have happened, what not. And as Ugabi mentions in the essay, as when she writes about the Johannesburg Biennale, as this uncle who left, who went away, that we all imagine and hope that one day could maybe come back because of the kind of impact it's said to have had. But when I was growing up, there was none of that. And so the only thing we could do is, again, in the same style and fashion, or drive behind Olu and Okwui starting a magazine, was that instead of us going to knock on people's doors, we create our own platforms and do our own work. And this is the kind of space where I come from. It's a very DIY kind of do-it-yourself, from Collective to the moment I moved to Johannesburg, being part of the Dead Revolutionaries Club. And my interest began to change because in Cape Town, in fact, we launched our collective, even though we had the idea of it for months to up to a year before we actually did anything public. We launched it with another attempt for a biennial, actually, which was Cape 07. And in 2005, there was an international conference in Cape Town, which was titled Cape 05, or Ekapa Sessions. And they had all like these international people coming in, and for me, that was my first real kind of live encounter with these discourses and whatnot. So we launched the Collective with the Cape 07, which was curated by Ugabi. And it had very, very minimal, actually a lot of the funding that was promised to the biennial never materialized. In fact, Gavin Janchis, who was the director of the biennial, pulled out because of the lack of funding. Kwezi Gula as well, who would later become a colleague, he also pulled out. He was the curator of contemporary collections at the Johannesburg Gallery at the time, which is a museum actually, regardless of its name. And Ugabi carried through with the biennial Cape 07. And we launched an exhibition called Akukhanya. It was in Lehulere, which is a township on the margins of Cape Town. And this for me was the first encounter of anything that is a biennale or like a large international exhibition. Of course, regardless of the funding obstacles, Gabi managed to bring in a few artists from the African continent, some artists who were working abroad internationally. especially works that didn't require a lot of money, like video art. So, yeah, I mean, there's this attempt. It happens again, second time, is Cape 09, and it never happened again. But by Cape 09, I was fully integrating into Johannesburg, and had been working with the Dead Revolutionaries Club. And this question always came out, like the Johannesburg Biennale. And I'm in fact still curious why there's still this talk about it, because a lot of people back home still, like, I've had curators, writers, and critics come and ask me as if there's some secret funder who's thinking about reviving this Johannesburg Biennale. Like, oh, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think it's relevant now, or do you think it's enough that we have a South African pavilion in Venice? And of course, these are very contentious issues in a country that is struggling still politically. And if anyone is following the news currently, there's a lot of unrest, and things are not as smooth as the painted picture of the Rainbow Nation. 2012 marked a very huge moment again in our history, where more than 40 miners were shot by the South African police. So there's a huge kind of unrest and question about the country's direction. And again, like, there's been a whole lot of controversy around the participation in the Venice Biennale, the National Pavilion. There was a controversy about the first one. We had the second one last year in terms of the amount of money allocated to writers, for example, who wrote in a catalog for the first one. The artist fees was like really huge sums of money. And of course, these are never easy things in a country which is really struggling. If anyone has been to the Johannesburg Art Gallery, which is supposedly like our public museum, which is really suffering in terms of infrastructure. They have money to collect works, but they can't maintain these works in good spaces. The building is leaking, the basement floods sometimes. So there's all these problems, which such events are weighed against, you know. And I can imagine that more so in '97 when Olu and Okwui were there, because there was also, '97 was a key moment in South African politics in terms of what people thought they had achieved against apartheid. Because '94 there was what was the ANC implemented something which was the RDP. And when we joke about the RDP, we say that it stands for Revenge of Dark People. But in actuality, what RDP means, Reconstruction Development Program. 97 marks a moment where the government changes its policies and shifts away from RDP to what is known as GEAR, which is a growth. Basically, it's a neoliberal kind of take on the economy. So a lot of privatization happens. There's a lot of unhappiness, unsatisfaction from grassroots, political organizations, community groups, and all of these. And why I mention this is because when I think about the Johannesburg Biennale, and the concept, the title, trade routes, and the history and the geography, it's curious that it happens in at least in Johannesburg. Of course, it's a multiple number of venues, but when I read, for example, one of the reasons why it was shut down is that it was too costly to maintain, but also of the low numbers of attendance to the exhibition. And of course, this is a very complex thing, because blacks weren't taught art in schools, right? But it doesn't mean that blacks weren't participating or making art or going to exhibitions. In fact, there were a number of collectives working in South African townships, which I've done research on. Was basically my undergraduate research, and I wrote a paper on this. And it's based on the interest I have through both the Google Active, the Dead Revolutionaries Club, and later co-founding Center for Historical Reenactments with Uguibe in Johannesburg. But what the collectives were doing in the 70s, they were working in the townships. And of course, the curious thing is that if you have curators based in New York, how do they access those people who are working there? Because South Africa, I mean, as we know, was a racially divided space. And in fact, those who even knew about these collectives and these artists were blocking some of them out intentionally because of the kind of radical politics that they were pushing, the kind of agenda. So there was certain silencing of artists based on the content of the work. So you find, in fact, in the 70s, there's a huge shift in the kind of imagery, the aesthetic, and this has to do with the clamping down of the government on artists, both writers, musicians, in terms of the content. There was a lot of bannings, a lot of writers going to exile, a lot of artists. Like the 70s is a very key moment. And it kind of impacted on the kind of art production that was happening in South Africa internally. So, I mean, these are kind of things that for me, like, they fascinate me in terms of trying to reimagine this kind of moment and within that socio-political context, the economics and what have you. But with regards to the Center for Historical Reenactments, when we launched the program, it was clear that it would take a 2-year lifespan, that after 2 years it should die. And of course, we hadn't thought about how it should die in 2 years' time. But nonetheless, we used the Johannesburg Biennale as a kind of framework of thinking about infrastructure, institutions, and the lack thereof in Johannesburg and South Africa at large. Of course, we're looking a lot at the African continent, what other people are doing. And in this way, also, of course, we're looking around because we travel. Wherever we find interesting kind of discourses and practices or kind of independent spaces. And it was very clear that for us that we were not an exhibition space where we would host or curate shows for other artists, because we've been approached by other artists that, hey, can I do something in the space? And for us was clearly a research project. It was to think around the idea or the concept of a biennale as an institution. Of course, we exhibited a lot of artists who were not only from the African continent, but based in European artists, American artists as well. Artists we thought were interesting in terms of our desires and interests as well. We found a connection.
I'd like to come in there actually very briefly and kind of reiterate, because part of what you're describing, I think, goes back to the question of what if. That's part of the imaginary, you know, what if the biennial had survived? And it'd be interesting to get your perspective on that as well. But here's what we thought. When you establish a biennial and you have the first one and you have the second one, nobody's thinking that it's going to die with the second one. You know, we're thinking, okay, after the second biennial, there'll be a third, and it's a biennial, right? We're thinking Venice, we're thinking Sao Paulo, we're thinking all sorts of places. Even we're thinking, you know, the Congo, where they've had a biennial for many years, you know, and still there, although nobody knows about it. So our thinking was, you've had the first biennial. It was very Afrocentric. It was all about Africa and integration within the continent. Now let's provide another model for the second biennial. And then you can see the differences between the two models. maybe somebody would have a third model to propose for a third biennial. And over time, if you take the time frame, for instance, of something like Venice, which had gone on for, at that point, 70-something years, going on 100 years, you're thinking, even if it lasts just 20 years, over 10 biennials, all of these conversations will tease themselves out in terms of what works, what doesn't, what's relevant to the place, what's not, what people prefer to see. Meanwhile, you're having these conversations, you're having these exchanges, you're hopefully still bringing in people from the outside in the event that there are still producers and cultural practitioners who have no opportunity to have that interface. That was our thinking. So we had no idea that they were going to pull the...
So you thought you could risk something without jeopardizing the whole enterprise?
No, we didn't think in terms of risk. It was just another model.
Let's go with one. Yeah.
That's really tough to come in after all of that. I don't know. I think to imagine a possible third biennial, I don't know. I kind of look at a lot of the arguments that were raised, and I remember going to Cape 05. Is that correct? The ICAPA sessions. And I just remember sitting there for the first time, and also my introduction. I think I was just at the end of my undergrad and was able to find money to fly down to Cape Town to attend a 2-day conference. And just seeing what a bun fight it really was around identity and the politics and the racial politics embedded within a South African discourse around contemporary practice. And just the thought of trying to get another biennial off the ground and trying to navigate that quite successfully. And I think Gabby in some ways got that right, where I think by nature of the funding being pulled was just pulling the scale right back. Because I felt partly embarrassed sitting there. I felt embarrassed because I didn't really fully understand the context of what this conversation really was. Coming from an assumed position of privilege as a white middle-class youngster studying art at a predominantly middle-class white art school, you kind of also start to become very aware that there's a whole bunch of conversations around you that you are not privy to by nature of your upbringing and your context. So you're sitting in this and you're trying to imagine how somebody really wants to integrate all of these conversations into some kind of meaningful narrative that in some way would start to make sense of the Rainbow Nation, which none of us have really, as South Africans, have really understood or, I don't know, actually even believed in. And I maybe speak for myself, and as I get older, the more and more apparent this kind of separation between this ideal of what this all could be and what it really is fundamentally different. And I think we also have a larger issue around how the government at certain points wants to define and redefine this narrative that we have to this idea. And it is really evident in certain instances around how funding is attributed to certain things and taken away from other things. We currently have this great, amazing theme park called Freedom Park, which is a presidential legacy project out in Pretoria, which is just northeast or north of Johannesburg. And it's built directly opposite to the Voortrekker Monument, which was an apartheid monument built to idealize the solidarity and the camaraderie of the Afrikaner in overcoming the oppression of the British and kind of migrating through the whole of Africa, of southern Africa to Johannesburg to find the gold fields. And you've got this big project and you've got this other thing, and you're kind of looking at these two things and you're going, and you want to place something in the middle of this. How are you really going to do this in a significant and meaningful way where you can in some way start to even just ask the core questions or the fundamental questions that need to be asked about South Africa as a place, as a home, as a residence for people? I also really, in some way, I was just, in terms of what was said, I might come across really wrong now, but I love the idea. It kind of feels like the second biennial was also a noble gesture to kind of give voice to something, but I don't think anybody was really sure what that voice was or could be. And I wonder if, even if the biennial had tried to address that local discourse in any way, I don't know if it really would have got anywhere. I don't think we're still 24 years later, South Africans are possibly ready to deal with that conversation. I don't know, Kemang, you might really feel different to what I do. And it's really hard to kind of make sense of what this context is.
Or say it again.
No, just in terms of just
rehave the conversation.
To have a conversation around what South Africa is. I think we really have to take very clear positions, and I don't know how many of us are really prepared to take those positions, I think, or to claim a very, very particular identity. I don't know, it just makes me nervous as a practitioner. Yeah, and also, I also question my position continuously as I practice and I make work. So,
but Vaughn, I remember a commercial from way back. The British are great at commercials, you know. I would just go to the theater just to watch the commercials because they were just hilarious. But there was I remember a commercial where I believe it's Anthony Hopkins would say, "It's good to talk." It was a cell phone ad or something like that. Yes, yes, exactly. It's good to talk. Imagine a structure where every 2 years, whether you like it or not, you had that conversation. But it wouldn't be just, if you have it on a regular basis, it will no longer be a biennial conversation. It'll then seep into the rest of the conversations, because these are things you guys need to confront. And you are doing that, but that one additional platform, an opportunity where it could have been done on a far more regular on a far more regular basis was taken away by opportunistic politicians. And I don't think that, I've always felt that it was a regrettable thing to remove that opportunity. Because no matter what the negatives were, and negatives will be more in terms of who is in charge, authority, individuals, and the power play. But in terms of the positives, there were so many of them, in my thinking, in our thinking, at least the potentials, that if that had been kept going, and the money is there in South Africa. In fact, for the second biennial, Enwezor raised almost 60% of the funds by himself, several $1 million. And a great deal of it came from within South Africa. It's South Africa, man. There's the gold mines, and there's the arms manufacturers and so on and so forth. In South Africa, the money's there. And so it dedicated. If there had been a devotion to making that an institution rather than a moment of political opportunism, the money could have been found to continue that conversation. So you guys can get together, you can break your heads or whatever you want, and then 2 years later, you have an extension of that conversation. Because every such society, talking about sites of trauma, every such society needs that conversation. After all, you guys had to convene some other conversation called a peace and reconciliation, whatever it was, and have some similar conversation outside of the cultural sphere. So the biennial, I think, would have provided a regular opportunity to revisit certain things in the past, as well as the present, and perhaps even propose ideas moving forward, rather than just having it in the newspapers, which is basically how it happens now. Occasionally a minister will say something silly, and everyone get crazy about it.
Should we maybe we should get some comments and questions from the room at this point? Or unless you want to come back to that, yeah? No, go for it.
I don't know. I mean, I think this was just my larger question with art practice in general, and it's the practice of privilege, just by nature of what it is. The fact that we can sit here, the fact that we can take our time and produce images that reflect on a context that is often a little outside of ourselves. I mean, I think this is the beauty of what practice really is, and I wonder, with the continuation of a biennial over years, how much it would have really had start to engage with a larger public where the conversation really needs to sit. And the question would be is, how do you start to engage a larger public at that scale to have that debate? Because I think that is, for me, is where the question is sitting. How is that narrative or that conversation or that dialogue being extended outside this very peculiar cultural precinct in Johannesburg, or this nature of what this practice is. And I think, yeah, I don't know, for me that becomes a really interesting question, is just how we start to take this practice outside of these confines of these safe spaces and really make ourselves vulnerable as practitioners or thinkers in a real context where people are really grappling with these issues on a day-to-day basis. I mean, the ability to step outside is fundamental and necessary to anybody, but it's in those contexts it becomes really interesting when you also understand that moving through the biennial, if you talk about a lack of audience, there's over potentially 15 million people moving through that area in any given day, just moving towards public transport routes. So, I mean, is there a lack of audience or a lack of reachability to an audience? And those become interesting questions, and it's an age-old conversation around art practice. But I think it's a really important thing to think about in that context as well, you know.
I know there are some people here whom I know are working on actually different aspects related to this. So it'd be great to get some comments and questions from others here. Yeah, Christina.
Okay, thank you so much for this conversation. This is very, I mean, I don't know much about South Africa, but I'm responding to many of the comments that you're making, just thinking about, let's say, peripheral spaces or the politics of art. And one of the big words that I keep hearing, something that I've been thinking about, is this notion of institution making and this DIY sort of approach to creating institutions. And this is something I've been thinking about the last few years, and I stumbled upon this really interesting philosophy from a Portuguese philosopher named João de Cabral. And what he said was, all theories on institutions are incorrect because they assume we start as whole individuals and we join institutions, but in fact, we start as complex, diverse. And what happens is when we make institutions, we become partable, we become specific. And I think, Kemang, you were talking about this too, with creating the Center for Historical Reenactment and then creating a deadline for it and a resolution to it as a way to not limit yourself to that expression of partability. And I think also what you're asking about is, you know, what can we do moving forward? And Olu says, well, what about this institution that you keep making, you keep expressing or articulating yourselves every time you come back to it? And so I think there's a real opportunity there of using this idea of institution making as a process, as a sort of potential formation that helps articulate yourselves and re-articulate yourselves all the time. But it's something that I find fascinating, that it seems applicable no matter what context you come in, that this institution making is very, very vital. And I see what role it's played in this context as well. So thank you for helping to bring a case study into this theoretical realm that I'm toying with in my head.
Yeah, just behind Christina.
I just want to say thank you as well. I love this. But for all of you, I think I was a teenager reading certain texts, and I also had fentanyl in my pocket growing up in the United States as an African American with the connection to the diaspora and the world that we're building and trying to open that door and success. And I think what's really pivotal to me is the idea of just reading about Johannesburg and thinking about this biennial. It seems like it actually operated as a text. So take someone like Toni Morrison.
mean, as Olu says, South Africa has a lot of money, but there's not money for funding the arts specifically.
I'm talking about arts not as in something that's separate from labor, but that
Yes.
the labor itself that people do.
Sustainability in practice.
Aha.
To the symbolic value, but also literal value. Like there are probably invention practice in Cape Town.
There's what? Invention?
There might be invention practices that people practice, that people are.
Convention.
Invention. People
Uh-huh.
being able to, invent, prototype, doing all kinds of things that could change how an area is now.
Well, there's a history that he alluded to of collectives in different townships doing precisely that and becoming almost cottage industries in producing and marketing and surviving on what the collectives and schools produced. That has a long history and very, very powerful history in South Africa. It's a very significant part of the history of art practice in South Africa. That's how many artists were able to survive under the apartheid regime or during the apartheid period. So that history is there of it's part of the DIY thing that you're talking about as well. But I think she raises it because there seems to be a repeated reference to there being no money. And there being no money meaning that the foundations are no longer investing. The government is obviously not investing, and therefore it becomes very difficult for people to enact certain practices. So I guess that's the question: is how have people continued to practice, but on a positive note, not one of, oh man, we're struggling, there's no help, so we're just doing the little we can.
Part of the damage that has happened to South African art history is, for example, one of the collectives that I studied, it's not written about anywhere. I discovered that these were people who were working in the township and were selling to local businessmen. These works are undocumented, right? I managed to salvage a few pictures with one of the guys who was leading this collective, which I was particularly interested in, but largely nothing. They find some reviews here and there, newspaper articles, but very minuscule with no images. And even them, they don't know where the works are. And they were surviving, like basically selling to people, store owners, shoemakers, whatever, people who are kind of entrepreneurs within these kind of communities. In fact, they even, this one collective, they brought in artists from outside of South Africa during apartheid, which I find was the most radical thing actually ever, to be able to bring in two Mozambican artists, one who had come into South Africa as a miner initially, left, became an artist, came back and exhibited there, and actually had a 3-page article reviewing his show. So he's one of the only ones who actually has work documented because of the story around him and the political kind of, the story around the politics behind him, being wanted by authorities, whatever. So there's that, and then of course there's a repeat of these kind of collectives over time, this DIY, and for different reasons throughout certain periods of time, but also at the same time for very similar reasons. So when we were working, when we started Google Active, we had no funding. We've never really had funding. The only kind of funding we had was being borrowed projectors to show videos. But we've never had funding. And we found that to a point, actually the government wanted to come. There was a minister of not a minister, a head of the arts and culture in the province where we work in Cape Town, came to us, in fact, and said, yeah, we've been hearing a lot about the work that you guys are doing, and we'd like to give you funding. And he asked for me when he came into the room, oh, who's Kemang here? And I said, it's me. It's like, I used to go to your house growing up. I was politicized in your house. Your uncle, we politicized us. So that was his entry point. And I found it strange that he would kind of first want to make this connection before talking about the work, right? And we sat down and thought about this, and we were very anti-government. And of course, this thing of coming in, yeah, I was politicized in your home, you know, in your kitchen, whatever, where you grew up, your uncle, and we were like, no, fuck this shit. We continued doing the work that we're doing because we were very politically charged at the time. And whatever work that we did was from found materials. We would pull in money together. Whoever had money would contribute from whatever you get money from your family or whatever. Others had jobs or would do a project there, you facilitate something, get some money, give to the collective. I, at the time, was also working in the television industry for a production house. So I was earning a salary, which I saved up enough to quit that job to focus on the collective work. So that's how kind of I survived, and because this was something I strongly believed in at the time, right? And there are other people who've attempted this kind of DIY thing who haven't been successful. There are others in Johannesburg, the Kurator Library, for example, which is a collective which has a library in the city center of Johannesburg, downtown. We've been doing amazing projects. I don't know, to which extent they're funding or not, but they've been doing quite a lot of good work. So I think basically people operate like with almost no funding. And it's, again, with the Center for Historical Reenactments, because Gabi does a lot of talks and get fees and stuff like this, so this money that goes back into the project itself. So we've never really had, oh, we're gonna give you funding for this or that.
Have you guys ever had conversations around how to actually monetize some of the activities so that you can sustain?
Well, for me it was
those
always clear,
activities?
especially with the Collective, which is something which led to its breakdown to a certain point, that for me, it was a purely an outlet for political ideas and activity, and that we should continue doing our individual things on the side, which sustain us financially. But then we had interest in museums. For example, there was a big exhibition in South Africa called From Pernif to Collective, which was supposed to be kind of a retrospective of the South African art in general, like from beginning to where it was then. And I was very unhappy, actually, because at that time I'd already been doing research on collectives that had been working in the 70s, which had done what we were doing. But because this was a history which was not written, I objected. But of course, when you work collectively, you become one body, so there's discussions and you have to sacrifice kind of, for the greater good, whatever. But for me, it was always clear that I refused to monetize that practice, which actually led to our kind of fracturing eventually, because of what I had foreseen and some others in the collective as the problems of monetizing it, that because we felt, or at least I did, felt that if I monetized it, if we did, then we would be to some extent forced to tone ourselves down and move away from what we had been trying to do, because actually we did have a very large audience. We had people coming in, and at some point were critiqued as pitching too high for our audience, being too conceptual, too smart, and I found this really condescending, because one of the most, I've had the most amazing conversations I've had actually about art is with people who had no kind of a wealth of knowledge about the arts, or because there's a kind of curiosity that they have towards this object or whatever it is that they're looking at, that it's interesting to talk about, and it's not as snobbish as the South African art world, which I really enjoyed. So for me, it was purely that, yeah.
This popularization is what's so exciting, and the fact that like someone like Steve McQueen, I think Steve McQueen and Isaac Julian, especially Steve McQueen, like the way that he just won, for the Oscar, it actually is like the platform that in 1997 was seen so esoteric, so critical theory is now mapped onto this Hollywood movie. So I think it's exciting.
Yeah, maybe Andrew.
Okay.
There's three questions here, I know. But
There we go. This is this is a question for Olu about the symposium format. On one level, it's just a very practical question. I'd be interested if you could explain a little bit more about who was involved, what the particular problematic was that you set up, how that played into this larger story that you've been sketching so interestingly. But then beyond that, I wonder if you could say a little bit about two other things. One has to do with how you saw this talks program or this conference in conjunction with the art that was exhibited. There's often a kind of a firewall that exists at biennials between the art and the talks, and so many people, while they might sort of tip their hat to the importance of having a discursive program, won't actually attend them. Everyone says that the most interesting thing about Enwezor's documento was the platforms, but those books are out in print, no one ever really reads them or talks about them. So if you could talk about what steps you might have taken to break that down, that would be great. And I'd also like it if you could say a little bit about, maybe I should just stop there.
I've got two more questions here.
There's a history that Dominic alluded to, right? The Havana Biennial, the third Havana Biennial, the talks program is very important. Maybe you knew of this through Gerardo, maybe not. There are other precedents going back to Tesla and so on. So
Yeah.
sort of how that history might have informed your approach.
Yeah, we were certainly familiar with some of that history, also because of the personal connections with some of those individuals. Gerardo, for instance, is sort of a distant mentor. And in terms of logistics, it was challenging, of course. Nothing on that scale had been done before, not in that part of the world. And I was coordinating that from South Florida. I was doing that from Tampa, in fact. Cost me several $1,000s of my own money to do that from Florida. But we were keen because I was working so closely with the artistic director, and because we did conceive some of the ideas for the exhibition itself together, and like I said, I named some of the co-curators, there was a much closer convergence, I think, between the symposium and the art that was exhibited, because the themes were meant to overlap. And we were both informed by the same critical discourses that were going on, the same writers, the same ideas, and so on and so forth, things we sat down and talked about. So while I would take formal credit for the symposium, it was jointly conceived. And while he would take formal credit for the biennial itself, there was also, that kind of collaboration to come up with the ideas. So I think in practice, it did, in fact, I believe it did dovetail into the art. So, and some of the artists who were participating, people like Coco Fusco and so on and so forth, were also speakers in the symposium. So ideas could be transferred, if not translated, from one platform to the other. In addition, of course, we also had the popular big scholars of the time, Andres Hyacin and Saskia Sasson. You had to, add Paderai and so on and so forth. You had to get those in order to attract certain people to to the conversations. But the logistics were very challenging, that's for sure. But Okwui was very effective, as I said, in sourcing support, financial, logistical, and so on, to facilitate that. The Northern interest, for instance, and I think the Northerns did also make other contributions beside taking curators to South Africa. That came through Okwi's connections with them. And there were several others like that, as well as, he's a very personable person, and being really physically in South Africa for the period of planning and putting the show and activities together, he was able to go out and interface with industry, with corporate entities, and tease out whatever support was out there that politicians probably didn't have the skills to. Well, that's politics too, but a different kind of politics. So I think that sort of addresses two of the convergence of ideas between the work and the talk, as well as some of the logistical challenges. Other than finance, which we overcame, I wouldn't say, I can't think of any crippling challenges that we faced, because individually we knew many of the speakers and had, in one form or another, worked with some of them in different spaces. So, and people were very excited to go to South Africa after '94. So that was an added incentive. It's like, who will go for us? Send me. And for instance, I mentioned to him that Sarat Maharaj, we brought him back to South Africa for the first time since 1972, when he left as a young person and went into exile. He had, after '94, he had no particular interest in returning to South Africa, even to visit. So it was like, you're the man, it's your country, you gotta go. Okay, I'll go, and it turned out to be quite an exciting experience for him as well as a returnee. That was actually part of the conversation as well. There were lots of people who were returning to their country for the first time, and who instantly became part of whatever conversation we were able to cobble together around practice, not just within the country, but also in their places of abode. So I think that kind of worked out.
Take maybe two more, or three if this time, Karen.
I guess I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about the strategies, whether they're formal or just ways that one has to kind of react to the different forces, basically, that are shaping the environment in which you're producing work, organizing work. And that does have to do with quintessential local tension. So there's the messaging, I think, that you both alluded to, or the way that the government is either propagating or shutting down narratives of nation building, citizenship, and the commons. So how so there's ways that obviously there's been a tremendous amount of funding directed for the World Cup, which you could say the legacy is now a bunch of stadia that local populations can't afford to go to or maintain.
I disagree, but
Okay.
but go on.
That's some people could, Sean Jacobs and so then, but then also the reality of someone like Okwui Enwezor and the curatorial team has provided in terms of bringing the world to South Africa and vice versa. So, so much of that post '94 messaging was directed at attracting
Go for it, yeah.
The landscape, well, there's shifting factors, and I think it really also depends on where you want to locate your practice as well. I think there's, in terms of just talking about funding at the moment, and there's been a drastic shift over the last 3 years, both with international shifting mandates again around cultural practice. So a lot of people are now shifting their focus back into health and other issues. So people like Kellogg's and Ford are also pulling out of the NGO sector, where people have been doing really valuable work around using art as a way of addressing the past and kind of really working in really interesting environments and really doing great work. I mean, that's separate of contemporary art practice. And then our national funder as well recently has shifted its mandate to address this divide between like a kind of more traditional practice that happens outside of major centers. So a lot of what they've been doing is shifting their funding back into those environments and moving it out of the centers. So we've just recently had 3 big dance companies in Johannesburg kind of panic at the loss of funding, but they've managed to get private benefactors to step in again and address the shortfall. So that has become really interesting. Outside of these, the funding landscape largely is made up by other cultural institutions like Pro Helvetia and Goethe. These are arms of the Swiss government and the German government. And they often fund, potentially, depending on how your kind of agenda or your work aligns, kind of, they will fund very particular projects. So it's sparse, that funding landscape and the environment that we work within. So our strategies may vary, and I think it also just depends on the discipline that you're working in as well. I mean, I straddle several disciplines. I work in theater, I work in dance, and I work as a visual artist in several capacities. So it often means that a project will shift its mandate as you work if you're applying for funding, but a lot of the work is self-generated, or money is worked, it's gained from other endeavors and practices and kind of siphoned across as we work. But I think sitting within this larger kind of narrative around what South Africa is and how it's trying to reframe itself, it's also really hard. I don't know, I find it really difficult to produce work in that line, or even just trying to take on some of those issues, because my interests aren't necessarily those, and I try to find more subtler and gentler ways of intervening in those spaces. And I have a really peculiar fixation on very odd things. So it's also really hard writing funding proposals and kind of just garnering the support that you would need for a project that doesn't necessarily address overtly a broader socio-political or socio-economic issue, but really is trying to find other ways of really uncovering new narratives. Sorry, so I might be tangenting a little bit, but I think that it becomes a really complex game of also how you manipulate your own practice to suit and adjust according to where you want to place it. Yeah.
Maybe just we'll take one more, I think, maybe. No, if you're super keen, we'll take 2 more. Okay, right. Okay, 2 more. Julian.
Okay, so maybe this is a comment more than a question exactly, but Gabby and Kovo's quote actually put me in a very strange frame of mind to listen to this talk, and it's been sort of boiling away in my head since you read it, Dominic, because of the strange tone of this quote and its temporality. Its sense of a past that looms and yet is inaccessible and can't be regained. And there's a sense there's a sense also to the biennial itself, that it was somehow for the nation or the polity that it meant to address, not now, not yet, that it was a kind of transnationalism that the country somehow, it was a future that it wasn't quite ready yet to meet. And so I wonder if there's some sort of temporality, some problem of temporality here, historicity. I mean, just talking about Fanon, the revolution is the now. That's the moment of presentness, and the moment, what we have without the fulfillment of the revolution is untimeliness. And so we have the not yet and the too soon and the figures of belatedness, and so Center for Historical Reenactments or the Dead Revolutionaries Club, or it's the sort of a past that can be cited but not accessed. And so I'm interested just to ask the question of temporality, time, history, that seems to float throughout this entire discussion.
Well, if I may.
Well, I didn't understand the question. So
most times the tone of a narrative doesn't necessarily reflect the facts on the ground. I don't think that the sardonic, perhaps even funereal tone of recollection around the biennial I think that's mythology. There were concrete accomplishments, and the residues are there. So it's not exactly that distant thing that we kind of hear about, the uncle who went away, and so that's beautiful poetry, but it's not exactly that, because the residues are there, individual practices are there, people who have now international presence, and I'm not necessarily emphasizing the international because it's international, but also because it has economic consequences are there, who able to sustain communities because of that exposure and that opportunity which has been perpetuated. What I haven't seen, which I would have liked to see, and I think that could still happen in the future, is people being able, some of those people being able to invest in other talent, in emerging talent within the country. If you're a Santomo for King, or you're a Bernicel, and you're selling work for I don't know how many $100,000 or $50,000 or whatever, being able to do, for instance, what's her name who did Biennial in the Netherlands? Yes, exactly. Being able to, as an artist who's successful, being able to reinvest in other emerging talent, not just as a teacher. I think that's great. I think that's very important. But there are other ways that artists can also get involved. But the residues are there, and they set a tone for subsequent conversations. For instance, prior to the second biennial, conversations around gender, not just black, white, but also gender, also sexual orientation, also the generational differences and schisms. Those conversations weren't public conversations. They were things that people talked about in shebeens, and young people get together and talk about them. They weren't, if you like, discourses. They were discussions. But those became discourses that went into texts, went into academies, went into young people going through those academies and inheriting some of those discourses. So it's not just an ephemeral phantom. It's just that these people weren't old enough to have the before and after perspective. But the benefits are certainly part of their heritage. And that's why I felt like, without necessarily advocating biennials as an essential institution, I don't think it necessarily is. However, I think that in some of those spaces, in a situation like South Africa, for instance, where something like that had already been tried, that if it had longevity for a little longer, it might have, some other of these conversations might also have been brought to the fore. Imagine an instance where you have these regular forums to deal with thorny conversations and issues. It's not just a couple of people writing in the newspaper, but you actually have regular forums to address them and disagree over them, and then take those conversations back to either your practice or to your academy or to your community or whatever it is. I think those are some of the aspects that might have been propagated further if it had survived. But I'm not nostalgic about it. I think it was timely. I sincerely believe it was timely because it provided another model to the Afrocentric, local, folk, those things were already there. It gave people another side of the coin, and then from there they could either meld them or keep them apart or find the edge of the coin, whatever else. And so it was real.
Let's take one more question then. Thanks, or comment. Yeah, I'm sorry, we'll go there.
I could just, I'm listening
Yeah,
to
really?
all of this,
Okay.
and there are obviously different perspectives. The reason that was given in part was both the lack of the public and the funding problems. If we look at those things, we can define them in a way that actually harmonizes everything I've been hearing.
But I don't no. I don't. Quite frankly, let me set this right. I don't think the critique about the public and the audience is correct.
Well, I don't either. And
Yeah.
I think part of the issue is how you define the public and the financing. Therefore, if we define the public as the larger art world, we can say in that context that the second biennial was a success. If we define the financing as financing that is locally based or outsider based, for example, getting from Norton Utilities, we can also define it as a successful undertaking. And so I think there's some interesting things we can follow through in terms of threads. When we talk about the public, we have to define what public we're talking about.
Yeah,
And on that level, you can find success for the biennial.
if you're looking for it.
Current problems.
Yeah, but no. Very quickly, very quickly, Hanru's projects, for instance, were in the she-beans in the townships. We went to them. We didn't just wait for them to be bussed into Newtown. We took projects into the communities. Now, we may not have done those collaboratively, but that was just one biennial. It could have been done the next time. That could have been a learning opportunity to improve on the next time. But we did actually go out of our way and go into the communities. We arranged for people to go into open studios with even younger artists in their own places without waiting for them to come. And school children were bussed in. I don't know the value of that, but they had that too. So I don't think that the charge of not reaching the broad public is an accurate charge. It's not actually factual. That's what I'm saying. If it were, then I would accept, and address it. But in factual matter, it really wasn't like that. I think it's in hindsight that people bring up some of those.
I think it's Patricia. You're waving your arms. Okay, go for it. Okay, this is the last question. You were sitting in the shadows. That's why I can't. But go for it.
Thank you all for the talk. I'm interested in the strategy of decentralization of the format of the biennial. In particular, the idea that by centralizing things, you are able to name to kind of gather what is happening, but with decentralization, you're able to kind of create an expansive. You can never understand. You can never name the culture or the history of what's happening. But in the fact that a biennial is, every 2 years, it's expensive and not necessarily sustainable, I was just curious about other frameworks or other models that can activate that check-in that you were talking about, Olu, and provide that space of discourse that's necessary for communities. I'm thinking a lot about social media lately. I'm also thinking about the space of magazines. That I was just curious about everyone's opinion on the idea of strategy of just decentralization and also other, just more, I guess, other sustainable discourse.
I think that's what we were doing with the Center for Historical Reenactments, is exactly that. It's I don't think it's a critique of the biennial or a desire for it to come back. But what it does is to use the framework of a biennial, that it happens twice a year, but that we did not want to become an institution, but still using this format as a research project. And killing it after 2 years. So we committed institutional suicide, right? If there's ever such a thing, but it's poetic. Whatever, we did it, we staged it, and it was just a way exactly of. I mean, your question, the Center for Historical Reenactments, basically is an answer to that. At least that's what I feel. And just to come back to Olu's comments about the realness of the biennial, I think when Oguibe speaks about the uncle who's left, is talking about it institutionally.
Yes.
Of course, I mean, the artists who are most celebrated in South Africa are the ones who went through the biennial. It was that platform of superstar making, if I can put it like that. Definitely, that's without a doubt. But I think it's more directed towards the biennial as an institution, as a cultural institution that is no longer there, and thinking about its absence, be it good or bad. And I don't think also like that the public coming to the show or not was a kind of sentiment that is held by artists or practitioners in South Africa, but it was a statement from the government. The City Council of Johannesburg is the one that used that as an excuse to close it down. Of course, one can never know what government agenda is, right? It could have been the fact that you have too many foreigners or whatever. Of course, there was a general sentiment that there's not enough South African artists on the show, which was touched on earlier. And what we did with the Center for Historical Reenactments, one of the projects we did was called Nakuranza, was to think exactly about the misunderstanding of this moment, which we looked at it as a misunderstanding, but take it into a particular event, which was the gunning down of a musician, Mozambican musician, not far from where we were based. He made a song called Nakuranza. Kito Balo is his name. And Nakuranza means I love you. So we did a project called Nakuranza as a way of rethinking, because also the era is where the so-called xenophobic attacks happen. So within this framework of the biennial, of course, we're touching on these issues which were controversial and contentious about it, but utilizing those and thinking about them in terms of activating a project in the present, which is not necessarily a nostalgia about a particular history or an inaccessibility, but to re-ask certain questions. And using, and I mean, we did a very amazing project, I feel. But all in all, I think South Africa is a very complex kind of, as I think any and most countries are, because there's a lot of different practices and people have different positions. There are artists who work mainly with commercial galleries. There are others who move between, like myself. And I'm able to say that even now, like I'll be involved in practices that don't have any monetary kind of return because I can afford to do so. I work with a commercial gallery now and I can afford to take this position, but not everyone can. And then there are artists who will write those funding proposals, and and others who try and just become obscure and just marginalized completely.
Well,
I'll say very briefly that you're right. I think that's one answer. If you go to the exhibition as well, you'd find several other examples, like what Ntoni Jabe is doing with Chimurenga and the magazines and radio, DJing, several platforms of social interaction as part of a conversation, as well as publications. And I totally agree with you that social media is a huge area that's not been quite well tapped into across the continent. In fact, not just in South Africa, but could be put to far more effective use. Back in the late 90s, in fact, that was my area of expertise is social media, not anymore. But an example, for instance, is in Austin, Texas, the University of Texas at Austin, for instance. There's a professor of African art history there who's set up this thing on Facebook called University of African Art. And they have regular conversations. Yesterday they had a conversation with an artist who was in Lagos, Nigeria. And you could ask questions from wherever you are in the world, and it's an opportunity for these people to introduce their work to a larger audience through Facebook, exchange images, talk about what they're doing, and perhaps I would imagine certain projects might come out of some of those conversations. But also it's about documentation. By doing that, you generate an archive of information about practitioners, and it's done on Facebook. So there's all sorts of opportunities to do some of what could have been done through more traditional formats and strategies. There's open source there, if you like, to do lots of things.
Okay, I'm just gonna end.
But see
to
the show.
Thank,
see the show. It's a great, fantastic show.
Thank Olu, Vaughn, Kemang. Kemang leaves tomorrow. He's been here 2 weeks. You come and see Kemang's work at YBCA. Vaughn and his collaborators are performing their piece Inhabitant in the evenings of March 14th, 15th. Thanks for this discussion this evening, and thanks for being here.